Ian Henyon believes the hopeless can make fundamental changes and live happy and productive lives. He joins us from Birmingham Treatment Center to talk about avoiding the use of guilt and shame, maintaining healthy boundaries, and the modalities they are using at their new facility in Alabama. Enjoy. Welcome to the Illuminate Recovery podcast. We shed light on mental health issues, mental illness, and addiction recovery. Ways to cope, manage, and inspire. Beyond the self-care we will discuss, you may need the help of a licensed professional. My name's Kurt Nider. I'm a husband, a father, entrepreneur, a handyman, and a student of life. I avoid conflict, I deflect with humor, and I'm fascinated by the human experience.
And I'm Shelley Mangum. I am a clinical mental health counselor, and my favorite role of all times is grandma. I am a seeker of truth, and I feel like life should be approached with tremendous curiosity.
I ask the dumb questions.
I fill in the gaps.
The Illuminate Recovery podcast is brought to you by Illuminate Billing Advocates. Make billing and collection simple with leader in substance abuse and mental health billing services. Verification and analysis of benefits, pre-authorizations, utilization management, accurate claim submission and management, denial and appeal management, and industry-leading reporting. Improve your practice's cash flow and your ability to help your clients with Illuminate Billing Advocates.
Ian Henyon is with us today. Ian is the executive director at Birmingham Recovery Center. Ian has seen people enter treatment who seem hopeless, only to witness them make fundamental changes that lead to happy and productive lives. He believes everyone is capable of such changes, regardless of age, gender, or addiction history. He is grounded by one basic principle: how can he help people have better lives? Ian, thanks for being on with us today. I think that's an awesome principle to be guided by.
Thank you very much.
As we kind of talked prior to recording, you mentioned that your facility is fairly new and that you've kind of worked pretty hard to get that baby up and running. Maybe just talk about that for a minute before we jump into anything else.
Sure. Well, the idea of Birmingham Recovery Center did not start with me. I have two other partners, and they are friends, and they are men in recovery. And about 10 months ago, they were working at a facility together and said, Alabama really needs some additional programs, and why don't we open a program there? And in December, they started talking to me. I knew, so that's Colin Harris and John Giannetto. And I knew John professionally, and he called me up and said, "Hey, we're thinking about starting a program in Alabama." And I said, "Well, good luck with that, because Alabama has a history of folks coming in and trying to make things work here, and for whatever reason, it just didn't." And so, for a long time, there were very few options within the state, but given their enthusiasm and Mr. Harris, Colin's father, who is, and his mother, Cindy Harris, they are our financial backers, and with their relationships, it made sense to me that this was worth a try, and particularly given the need within the state. And so the regulatory environment is still challenging here. It took us months and months and months to go through the licensing process, and I'll certainly say that the intention of that is to make sure that the people that are providing services are doing it to the best of their ability. But we are one of maybe 3 programs in the state of Alabama that provide these services, and there certainly needs to be more, and I would love to see some additional options in the state and sort of loosen that process a bit, just to allow additional providers come in and allow the best to compete. And I think that really benefits the folks that are struggling with addictive disorders.
It seems like there's a bit, as you had said, Alabama's got a little bit of barriers to coming in and really offering the full spectrum of care that people need when, when they're struggling with addiction.
That's right. And given where we are in the state, we're about 90 minutes here in Birmingham. We're about 90 minutes from the border of Tennessee, so about 90 minutes to Nashville. We're a couple hours from Atlanta, and so a lot of folks, they were finding or were heading out of state to seek those treatment services. And for those that could, they would stay out of state to help maintain their recovery. And so it certainly was not lost on us that Alabama was seeing a lot of their more promising young people leave the state and stay in some of these other places. And of course, for the more established person that may have gone out of state to get residential treatment, they didn't have a whole lot of options to come back to. And so for the folks that needed to continue to receive services, again, they were really limited.
Mm. The other thing that we've seen with a lot of other programs is there's this really valuable community element to treatment, right? Like I think as an outsider to the industry, it would be tempting to think, well, it's not the end of the world if they go to Atlanta or if they go to Nashville or whatever. They'll be back in 30 days and they'll be fixed, and it's not only is it not that fast, not only is it a longer process, but we've had probably 20 people on the podcast where not only did they go to treatment somewhere and then decide to stay and be a part of the community, but so many of them end up working at that same facility or a nearby facility, right? Or, they get involved in the industry and that same original community becomes so valuable to them. And so I think it was probably lost on a lot of society that, listen, when they go to Nashville to get treatment or they go to Atlanta to get treatment, they don't come back ever, right?
That's right. That's right. And in fact, that's my story. I went to Arizona for treatment and decided to stay for a while, but got offered a job at the facility where I completed the program. And there was no thought that I was going to get in the field. I needed a job, and I enjoyed engaging at that program, and ultimately decided to go back to graduate school and get a master's degree, and stayed in Arizona for 7 years. And the only thing that brought me back east was I have family here, and so it was time to do that. So you're 100% right, Kurt, that people do tend to stay, particularly where they feel safe and where their support network is, where they've developed that.
The other thing that's tricky too about that, because for me it's really tempting to start to blame government, right, or start to get mad at who are the cronies behind the curtain screwing this all up for us. But at the end of the day, they really depend on professionals, right? They really depend on the industry to say, well, here's really the best course of treatment or whatever, and here's how we help manage that. And it's a bit challenging because you're trying to marry like politics and science, which we know is not really easily. But even as an industry, or even as when you get into the science part, I don't know that we really are all on the same page there either, right? One of the kind of headline things that you're seeing right now is like this whole Britney Spears thing, right? Which is huge controversy. She obviously has dealt with mental illness, and the court doesn't know how to deal with it. They just say go to a doctor. She doesn't want to go to a doctor anymore. So that kind of a problem. And so the question then, as you're opening this treatment center, is, what's the approach going to be, for you and for Birmingham Treatment? What's your approach to treatment? Is it are drugs part of that, program? Are they not part of that program? Is it 12-step based? What's your approach?
Yeah, and no doubt that we are, as a field, are not in agreement at all in terms of how the best way to approach this. And I think that's been part of the problem, and certainly part of the problem with the perception from the consumer side of the field. But to answer your question, I did get sober at a very strict 12-step oriented, highly structured, highly regimented program, which I think was really important for my recovery, and is important for some people. But our approach is going to be a lot more flexible, and the longer that I stayed in the field, the longer I realized that to try to force something like as complex as a human being into a specific mode of treatment is going to help some, but it's going to exclude a lot of people as well. And I didn't want to do that. And so number one is, yes, absolutely, our program can prescribe medication and support people that not only struggle with mental health issues and maybe even some more profound mental health issues that would make a lot of programs nervous. So both our physicians are double board certified in addictionology as well as psychiatry, and so we feel very comfortable treating the client that true duly diagnosed client. The other aspect to this, of course, is we are primary substance abuse. And so to treat substance use disorders, there is a variety of medications that can be utilized. And then oddly enough, we have a special term for these medications. And we don't have special terms for any other mental illness. We don't say that Zoloft is medication-assisted treatment for depression. But we do have that for addiction. And so I say that because I bristle when I talk about medication-assisted treatment. We do provide medication that will support someone's desire to maintain abstinence from their drug of choice. One of the more controversial ones within the field, of course, is buprenorphine-containing medication. Most people know that as Suboxone. And on the one hand, I understand why there's a struggle with that, and I had to experience from a provider side, seeing clients prescribe that medication and seeing them much more stable than somebody that just stopped using heroin 2 days ago. And so my experience is that under the right circumstances, buprenorphine-containing medication is highly effective and can absolutely change people's lives. I had a client a couple years ago that was sleeping on a mattress behind a blood donation center. And he would wake up every morning, donate, and then go buy heroin. He had been to upwards of 30 treatment programs. He finally came to us. He was prescribed Suboxone and eventually transitioned to Sublocade, which is the long-acting injectable. And the man's been sober for a couple years now. And is manager of a large retailer. He's maintained employment. He has connection with his family again. And it's like, that's why people get sober. That's what we call sober. And it doesn't matter kind of how we got there. And I want to see people having better lives.
Well, and it doesn't look the same for everybody, even if you're only pooling the population that doesn't use medication, right? Okay. Sobriety is different for everybody anyways.
100%.
Well, and the challenging, it's very controversial. I mean, we talked to someone just the other day, and it wasn't on the podcast, although I think we've touched on this, is, especially if you're old school, sobriety was that you were on anything, not that you stopped using drugs so you could go on a medication because that didn't feel like sobriety. And there are still plenty of people in the industry, as hard as we've tried to change that stigma, that still struggle with that concept of if you're on medication, you're not really sober. And that's so silly, right? Because someone who has diabetes, are we going to go to them and say, hey, you got to get off your insulin, or you are not, you're not really sober here?
Right. Call your sponsor and your diabetes will stabilize. And unfortunately, and I'm not throwing rocks at 12-step recovery. It's how I'm a big supporter of that. It's how I got sober as well. However, there are some things that need to change. And there's a lot of programs that are still stuck in that perspective that not only can you not receive buprenorphine-containing medication, but if you have a panic disorder and you need to be prescribed, a low-dose benzodiazepine so that you can actually sit in a room with other people, it's like, no, we can't have that. Or an ADHD, a stimulant-based ADHD medication, which is also someone who is truly ADHD cannot sit in a room for 2 hours at a time. It's not going to work. It's going to fail. Now, I'm not a physician, and so I'm not going to say what medication works for a particular person or not. I'm going to leave that up to a doctor that's got a lot more education than I do. And if the doctor says this person needs some Klonopin in their pocket, that every once in a while they might have a panic attack, but generally, if just knowing that they have this in their pocket, they are much more stable, then why would I not want them to do that? Now, the moment that they start abusing the Klonopin, then that's a clinical issue that has to be addressed. And we need to have a different discussion about that support.
Well, I love the experience that you bring to the table, Ian, because you've talked a little bit and skirted on it a little bit that you have a recovery story, and these topics we're talking about, they're not going away anytime soon. They are, they're part of the dynamic of the industry, and there's that push and pull, which I think really helps us get to that best practice place, right? Is because medication for some isn't a good answer. And for others, it's like the only answer. And so we got to figure out what that in between is. I'm curious if I can divert us just a little bit to have you talk a little bit about your recovery experience, some of that background of how you ended up there, and now you're kind of stayed in the industry, right? You want to give back.
Yeah. So of course, like most people, I didn't wake up one day and say, I'm going to use substances until I need to go to Arizona for 10 months. But that was ultimately the result. I think my story is fairly typical in that I started drinking at a very young age. I started smoking cigarettes at a very young age. And if you look empirically at that, nicotine use really is the gateway drug. And I remember drinking for the first time at an 11 or 12-year-old kid. And I loved it. And it was absolutely the most favorite thing that I had ever done. And I really oriented my life around alcohol and ended up, I went into the commercial real estate field after I graduated from college, and that was a great job to drink alcohol all the time. You drank with clients, and you drank in airports, on airplanes, and at parties, and on golf courses, and it was really fabulous. And then, of course, I also was a cocaine user, and between those two, I ended up in treatment at the age of 38, and of course I didn't think that substance use was my problem. I had a problem with the world, and of course I said I'm depressed and I'm anxious, and I don't understand how to do life, and substances are the only thing that help me feel better, and you can't ask me to stop doing that. And the very excellent people at Prescott House in Arizona said, Ian, you've got to get the substance out of the way before you can look at some of those other things. And they were exactly right. And look, getting sober was the hardest thing I've ever done. I've been sober for 14 years now, and I never want to be talking about my sobriety in weeks or months ever again. It's too difficult, and I don't say that to certainly dissuade anyone from getting into recovery, but I do understand when someone comes into my office and they say, Ian, I really don't want to stop using. And I'm like, yeah, I know you don't. And that's okay. What I ask them is, can you commit to stop using substances for some period of time, say 90 days? Can you do that? And they say, absolutely, I can. I go, okay, well, let's start there. And let's see if your life gets better. And if your life gets better, then we talk about ways of helping you extend that.
That's a powerful way. You talked about, Ian, that you felt like that smoking cigarettes was a gateway for a lot of people that start into drugs. It certainly was for you. I'm curious, and I see, there's this controversy about facilities allowing smoking and not allowing smoking. Where do you stand on that? And sometimes I think, and this is my own thinking, you give me your opinion, is smoking harder to stop than all the other drugs?
Yeah, I think that the habit that's involved with smoking is just everything that's involved from of course, cigarettes are a nicotine delivery system. And of course, it's nice to smoke after a meal. And of course, you're doing something with your hands, and it's social, and there's so many aspects wrapped up in that. And so it is incredibly difficult to stop that habit. And of course, now, with the popularity of vaping, there's things there's barriers to using nicotine that, not with smoking cigarettes, it tastes bad, and it turns your teeth yellow and your fingernails yellow, and all these things that people go, you know what, I don't think I'll do that. But here along comes vapes, and they don't burn, and they taste better, and so I think it's going to create a problem moving ahead as a lot of younger people start using nicotine at earlier ages. Now, that being said, I'm not in favor of banning things. I think people will find a way to do things that they want to do. I think people need to understand what the consequences of certain decisions are. And we do allow smoking and the use of nicotine products at our program. I do tell our clients that, although it sounds daunting, you have a better chance of maintaining sobriety from your drugs of choice if you also eliminate nicotine at this point, and we can support you in doing that. Would you like to do that? And some say yes, and some say no. And so it's certainly a recommendation. And then later on, and of course, so I didn't stop using nicotine when I got sober. In fact, I had a physician, and I was in graduate school, and I was actually using smokeless tobacco. And I'm in graduate school, and my physician said to me, he looked at my chart and he said, I see you're still using the smokeless tobacco. He said, I'll make you a deal. If you can commit to stop using that, I won't charge you for today's visit. And I was about 4 weeks out from the end of the semester, and I thought for a moment, and I said, I can't do it. I've got too much stuff to do. And so it would be several more years before I did eventually stop using nicotine altogether. So it is difficult.
Yeah. And it's like you said, there's so many cultural factors associated with it. People at work go out and smoke together, and you're doing something with your hands, all of those pieces.
The smoke break,
Yeah, it's tough. Yeah, I just think it's interesting because, addiction comes in so many shapes and sizes that it's very interesting to talk about it in the real world of what are we all doing, right? And what are our addictions? Because I think we all, on some level, they might not be the same as a drug. They might not be the same as, alcohol or cigarettes, but we all have our addictions, I think, that we're fighting, right, on some level or another.
Yeah, and we can look at those as, Smart Recovery talks about things in terms of bad habits, and I'm not necessarily quoting them verbatim, but that's how they frame the things that people want to change within that program. And there's lots of things that people do that are not in someone's best interest, but that our brains really like, and our brains want us to repeat those things. And so we end up doing them to our detriment. Certainly not to the level that substances do, and we know that's the most powerful addictions that there are. But of course there is gambling. Sex addiction is a thing, and it's terrible, and I would not wish that on my worst enemy. And I've seen people recover, and I've seen people struggle in that. Eating disorders are in a similar vein, not quite, but similar, and it is really difficult to recover from all of these.
Definitely. So, as a new facility, I'm wondering, I know that we hear about a lot of, I'm going to say, I'll use the word alternative approaches, extensions of recovery, different things that people engage in. Mindfulness, I guess, could be considered one, and meditation and yoga. But we're seeing some come on board that, have been in the industry a long time and are getting some steam, like neurofeedback or transcranial. Some of those different kinds of modalities. Are you guys planning on utilizing any of those, or what's your thought process around those?
We are going to look at all the tools that are ultimately going to be helpful to our clients. We don't plan to implement any of those that we mentioned, or that you just mentioned. But here's the place that we come from, and we recognize that addiction really is based on or based in childhood trauma, and not necessarily the big T trauma that we think of as traumatic events, although that's a lot of it. So sexual abuse and neglect, but that developmental trauma that comes from childhood that has not been necessarily recognized within the industry, and want to start talking about that. Talking about even generational trauma. So where I had a client a number of years ago whose parents had some unresolved trauma, and this woman just could not get sober. And I finally asked her, is there anything traumatic in your background? And she said, wow, like no one's ever asked me that before, and explain the situation. And so being able to talk about those things and the environments that people grew up in, and it's not necessarily anyone's fault, it's just kind of what happens. And whether that be a parent that was using, or another caregiver's anger, and creating a fearful environment, and of course that was learned behavior for them probably. And so to begin addressing those things, and look at attachment patterns, and how those may have been affected growing up, and start working on repairing the attachment as well. So that's really going to be our primary focus. And if some of those other things can help resolve those, then we want to look at them.
Yeah, and I love your approach, Ian, because what you're talking about is at the core, right? Attachment and connection. That is the antidote to addiction, and that's familiar. We all know that. We understand that, because when we're using, we're isolating and engaging in all sorts of things that are unhealthy. So I love that approach, and I love that you're focusing on some of those core pieces, right? The basics.
Well, we know too that when we take substances, our brain then secretes substances that mimics that attachment, and we become attached to those substances, and that's why people in this field we're so offended when somebody uses. We go, oh my gosh, we've been treating them, and we've been working so hard, and they went and used. And it's like, well, hang on a sec. We're asking someone to give up something. It's like telling somebody, like, listen, your mother isn't very good for you. Don't talk to her ever again. And people would go like, are you nuts? I gotta tell, this is my mom. And it's the same thing when it comes to substances. And so again, when someone uses to be surprised, it's like, okay, that happened. Let's figure out some ways to help you not do that again, or to make a different decision, because they may do it again. But to help them perhaps make a more rational decision.
Oh, so you mean we shouldn't shame them when
Yeah,
they use?
how about that? Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know a lot. I'm not going to tell you that you know, I know as a lot of different modalities and that type of thing. Here's what I do know. If shame worked, you know, I would need a different job, because I think parents and courts and cops could just tell somebody like, hey, stop being a bad person. Like, why do you want to be a bad person? You can be, so think about all that you have to work for, and you're throwing that all away. And here's the thing, I got those messages and it didn't make sense to me. I felt like I was crazy. Like, you're right, why would I do these things? Well, I must be a terrible person. No, it's the way our brains oriented with the substances.
I love it, Ian, because I can hear how, you know, how much you fight against that shame piece and helping people normalize the experiences that they're having. Addiction, like you said, it's a way to solve a problem. We're self-medicating something else that's going on, and if we're going to shame somebody about that, what we're saying is that we don't really understand what we're talking about.
Well, again, and then back to that distinction. So, someone that's bipolar and might be in a manic episode, we wouldn't sit them down and go, why did you go to Home Depot and spend $10,000? That was a terrible thing to do, right? We wouldn't say that. We would say, oh gosh, that's not great. Let's help you. Let's get you to see a doctor. We're gonna get you on medication. We're gonna help you with therapy. We're gonna give you coping skills. So hopefully that doesn't happen again. And we never tell them, like, you know, you're a real jerk for getting manic.
Well,
But we deliver those same messages to addicted people all the time. Even well-meaning clinicians will ask these questions like, why did you do that? Or you're not trying hard enough. Or you don't want to get well. I heard that. You know, even when I'm in the field, someone go, you don't want to get well. And I'm going like, that doesn't make sense. Of course they want to get well. They're also trying to feel better.
yeah.
I think it's really easy to understand, like, the damage of shame, and it's really challenging to learn how to communicate without it.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And how do you learn that?
Well, that's a really good question, right? Because it stands to reason that we could tell somebody like, hey, don't call your dealer. Don't go to the liquor store. Like, how hard is that, right? But as I got more into the field, because what happened was it didn't make sense to me that people were relapsing so much, right? And as I started looking at it, and it's like, all right, we know that addiction impairs decision-making and impulse control. And it dials down that part of our brain that says, hey, this is a bad idea, don't do that. It dials up the part that's like, oh, you really do want to go to the liquor store, right? And understanding that that's what's going on, rather than a rational decision-making process. And again, when it comes to addiction, we want to treat people like they're making rational decisions. And they're not. It's not like they're bumping into walls and you know, that they're going to fall over or anything like that. But again, when someone makes these decisions and we're like, oh my gosh, why did they do that? Well, to understand that it's based in the way their brain has developed and then oriented around the substances, then it makes sense. And then we can treat them compassionately.
And it takes time and effort to learn that piece, like Kurt was saying. How do we learn not to be shameful? Because our whole culture is based around it.
Yeah.
And you say we don't tell someone who's bipolar in a manic episode that, they spent $10,000, what's wrong with you? No, yes, we do. The whole community says, what is wrong with them? Why are they doing that? Because we look at them as though they're the same rational place that we are.
Right.
And they can't make sense of it. And I can't tell you how many times I talk to families and go, okay, but you have to understand they're not in the same place you are. They don't think the same way you do, and stuff's going on inside of their body that does not allow them to process the same way that you would process. They are not well. They need help. And it's not that there's something wrong with them, right? But those messages are out there, and when we don't understand something, it scares us, and that the shame just naturally comes out of our mouths, right?
That's right. And it is important, too, to acknowledge the incredible frustration of family members who have gone through this over and over again and have said, I've sent my kid to the best treatment centers and they still keep using, and what's going on? And then you ask them, have they ever done any neuropsych testing? Has there ever been, have they ever addressed trauma? How, as a family, what have you guys done to help make some changes? And but again, to acknowledge the frustration, I think is really important. And we have to come at it from both sides and say to them, like, look, your loved one is not making rational decisions. They're not doing it to make you upset. But your feeling of being upset is absolutely appropriate. And now, how do we help both address this situation that's incredibly destructive? Because we know that you love your family member, right? Nobody wants to tell a family member, please don't call, stay out of the house. We don't want you around, right?
Yeah, nobody does that, wants to do that. However, when they start to really grab a hold, and these things all take time. Like, we're not just going to flip a switch and we're going to get it. But it's the same thing around healthy boundaries. So often people are punishing those who do something that they don't like, thinking that that's a healthy boundary, not realizing that boundaries are a way to keep ourselves safe, right? It's about us. And when you really, and you can tell when somebody's using a punishment as opposed to a boundary, because it sounds like a punishment. If you do this, I am going to you. And it's like, no, it has nothing to do with that. They don't get it. And I remember it took me years to go, oh, no wonder it always sounded like these people are talking about punishments, because they were, and it wasn't a healthy boundary, And so how do you learn that when everybody around you is doing that? So I love those concepts. They take a long time to wrap your head around when you're in those situations, because some of us, more and more, we're all going to be touched by addiction, mental illness in some form or fashion, whether it's ourselves or a loved one. But until you're exposed to that, you don't have any frame of reference. You really don't understand. And so it requires a lot of seeking information and getting help.
That's right. And it is such a complex situation. And as far as, a mental health disorder, addiction, in my opinion, is the most complex mental health disorder there is, because we know that it causes changes and impairments in the brain, and we know it changes behavior and it impairs our perceptions. And of course, our brains love substances. It really does. And so to try to make those changes and like, oh, hey, you're right. Spending all my money on cocaine is a really bad idea. I think I'll just stop doing that. It's not that easy, and to make sure that we deliver that information to everyone involved. Let the client know that, hey, you're not a terrible person and you're not crazy. You're doing things based upon a brain disorder, and hey, family, your loved one is okay. They just need a lot of help, and they still need your love and support, and this is how you can do it in the best way possible. And your feelings of anger and frustration are appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely. It's tough because you'd have to do both sides. You brought something up, Ian, that I think I haven't heard it talked about a lot. I think we're starting to skirt it a little bit in our industry, in the therapy industry and counseling industry. But you talked about generational trauma and generational things that we bring to the table. It's a little bit harder to touch that because you talked about the lady who parents had some trauma, and she could touch that. But sometimes that generational stuff goes back further to where you didn't even know them, but it's coming through the genes, right? That stuff is it's in our body. It gets handed down genetically to us. Do you see a lot of that, and what's your experience with that kind of a trauma?
Well, when you explore with the client, you ask them, is there anything traumatic in your background? And they're like, no, I had a great childhood. And then you explore a little bit about what the family dynamic is like. And they say like, well, mom kind of keeps to herself. Dad's the one that does a lot of the parenting, and mom works a lot. And then you ask a little bit more about what were her parents like, and then if they have that information and they can say, oh well, her grandparents, were died in a really tragic situation, and then you can go, okay, so that's where we start, and we can kind of look back to that and say, everyone was trying to protect themselves and survive the best way they can based upon this really terrible event. And they went through life passing this on, and not because they didn't love you, it's just the way it happened. And so know that some of these messages that you got were from a long time ago, and they're not the truth. And we can start changing those messages.
Yeah. And I like that because at some way, shape, or form, you're gonna be able to. I like the way you go back through the family, like those genomes and stuff are a really good way to kind of capture those family dynamics. That somehow it shows up, even if they can't tell you who it was or what it was, they can tell you about the patterns that are showing up, and you can start looking at those and going, maybe that's not appropriate here, maybe that doesn't still apply, and still look at it, right? So it doesn't have to be
Sure.
untouchable.
Sure, and of course, like everything, this is not everyone fits within this paradigm, but it fits for a lot of families, and all of a sudden people start scratching their heads and they go, yeah, hang on a sec, you're right, some stuff did happen, and now I don't feel crazy, and I think for the first time, I feel a little bit of hope that actually something can be different, instead of floating through life just feeling like a victim of life.
Yeah. You talked about the idea that a good share of substance abuse is tied to trauma, even if that's little t traumas, which often it's a lot of little t traumas. What approach do you take with trying to deal with trauma? Because there's a lot of different approaches. Sometimes talk therapy isn't as effective as other approaches. What's your take on that?
I think the jury is still out. So you're talking about some of the more specific approaches like EMDR, brain spotting, and that type of thing? Or?
Well, there's a lot of them out there, but yeah, what kind of approaches do you use that really help people touch those parts, because we know that the brain stores that trauma a little bit differently, and accessing that, if you're a child, you may not have, words to express it because it was pre-verbal, things like that. What would be your approach?
So, a lot of what we do and a lot of the focus of my clinical work has been with helping people to stop the substance use, and just speaking to the trauma and saying like, hey, this is there, and it needs to be addressed, and we're not going to be able to get to that while you're still drinking or smoking weed or whatever it might be. I don't have any specific training in the various modalities, but understanding that again, it is old and likely started in childhood with some accidental behaviors, and just being able to talk through those things and to change those messages about how that have been handled differently? What could your thoughts have been that might have been more healthy, because now you're a 30-year-old, but at the time you got these messages, you were 6 years old. And what would you say to that 6-year-old that, didn't deserve to hear that? And so that is where I would start with my clients.
Right. And I think it's a really good place, because this is probably the first time that anybody's ever suggested there's something more, right? And suggested that some of these patterns that they've always known and haven't known anything different could actually be contributing. So I think that's a perfect place to start, especially when they're in addiction recovery.
Yep.
Some of that deeper trauma, and even you spoke, just what you just said is, some of that inner child work is touching on that nonverbal kinds of things, but even acknowledging that, hey, this was traumatic, and we probably ought to consider thinking about it differently. So I love that, and I think it's a good balance with what you're doing. So I appreciate you kind of, talking through some of those. So it can be really controversial and very difficult, because these are hard things. When we're dealing, like you said, addiction is probably one of the most complex things that people deal with, and it's so ingrained in our brains and the way they function and in our bodies and the stimuluses that we get, that we really do have to come at it with some experience and knowledge and compassion, and certainly dispel all of the shame that they've been hearing probably most of their lives.
That's right. And recognizing again that one person's experience is going to be very different from somebody else's, because I was able to go into an AA meeting for the first time, and of course that was awkward and scary, but I could sit there and power through it. The longer I've been in this field, there's a lot of people that have barriers to that very basic behavior. And again, if it is a traumatic event or a really bad anxiety disorder, to tell somebody, hey, you need to go to meetings and you need to get a sponsor, and just do it. And they're going to look at you like, I can't do that. And so again, to have a bit more compassion for that person that struggles, and then help them, okay, how about if we talk about what does it look like to you just to drive up to the building? How does that feel? Let's start there, right? And to start with some basic stuff instead of just get a sponsor, read the big book, and you'll be fine.
Yeah, I agree. You got to meet them where they're at, and
Yep.
especially people that have, sexual trauma, abuse, those kinds of things. They can't, trusting, people they don't know is probably one of the most scariest things that they have to face. And so allowing them to do that on their pace and where they've come from is important. It gives them that sense of control and choice, which you can't take that away.
That's right.
I love it. Ian, I know that you've done a lot of work over here in the last little bit trying to get your program up and going, and being able to help people in Alabama where there's a great need and some barriers to getting those treatment programs up and running. Tell little people how to get a hold of, connected with your program and even connected with you if they want to reach out.
Yeah, BirminghamRecoveryCenter.com is our website, and 205-813-7400 is our number. And please, I am always open to speaking with somebody, even if this is not the right program, because again, this is a confusing process, and it's really challenging. A family's in crisis, or a person is in crisis, and what do? They Google for some information, and there's so much information, and to wade through that. We are always happy to field a call and to say, hey, look, either you need more than what we can offer, or it sounds like to me that you need to see a therapist and maybe some medication, and we can make some recommendations for that. Or Birmingham Recovery Center could really be helpful for you, and let's talk about getting you in here. So always happy to have those discussions and to help them in that manner.
I appreciate that, Ian, because it's a confusing time for families, and and they don't always know what to do, and they've tried everything that they can think of, but they just need more resources. So it's good to have somebody that's been in the field, that's been through recovery, and that has the wisdom and understanding that you do, that can help, navigate them through that. So I love that. And I hope, I do, I hope a lot of people reach out, because I think you do have the understanding to really help them on both sides, both the person dealing with addiction and the family who's struggling as well with that person that they love.
Well, I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk about my perspective on the field and talk about our new program. And it has been a real team effort to get this thing up and going. And we have a fabulous staff and a great team to support my perspective.
Very nice. Well, appreciate it. And we look forward to, catching up later and seeing where things are at in a little bit from now.
Great. Well, Kurt and Shelley, thanks so much for doing this. And it's really pretty cool. And I appreciate you reaching out. This was pretty neat.
Thanks for being on, Ian.
Yeah, of course.